welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at a specific genre of Shakespeare plays called the history plays. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you who have subscribed to me on Patreon. I really appreciate how you are supporting my ability to make videos like this. And for those of you who haven't subscribed yet, it's a great opportunity not only to support me, but also to get a whole lot of really cool resources that I make available to my patrons over there. So check that out if you'd like. The genre of Shakespeare histories is one of the three major genres that was included in the original first folio of Shakespeare's work shortly after his death. His plays were mostly compiled by his friends and sorted into three categories: comedy, tragedy, and history. And when we talk about the history plays of Shakespeare, what we actually mean are the plays of English history. Shakespeare also wrote three plays of Roman history, which are usually considered tragedies, or sometimes given their own category, the Roman plays. But although those are definitely based upon historical events, they aren't considered histories simply because Shakespeare's history plays are particularly about the kings of England. The majority of these history plays are made up of two tetralogies, a series of 4 plays encompassing the life of Richard II through Henry V, and another series encompassing the lives of Henry VI through Richard III. One can read all 8 in order. However, they were originally written as a series of 4 and another series of 4. And in fact, they weren't written in the correct order, but in reverse order, something like the original 2 Star Wars trilogies. Aside from those 8 plays, which make up the bulk of Shakespeare's history genre, there are 2 outliers: King John and Henry VIII. Both of these stand alone, although they touch on similar themes and, of course, fit into the history of England. There are 2 others worth mentioning as well. One is King Edward III, which is often excluded from the Shakespeare canon, even though it seems that Shakespeare had a hand in its creation. Shakespeare definitely was very, very familiar with Edward III, and used a great portion of it to help him in his writing of Henry V, one of his most famous history plays. And there's also the very strange outlier Sir Thomas More, which is well worth examining. It's different, though, because it's not focused particularly on a king, but rather on an advisor to a king. And Shakespeare's role in its creation was unique and somewhat limited. Shakespeare's history plays are a lot of fun to read, in part because they're very different from his tragedies or comedies. They give a vision into British history, although that vision is somewhat compressed, stylized, and manipulated to create a plot. True British historians often get irritated at Shakespeare for taking so many liberties with their history. And the depiction of England is not just straight-up patriotism and nationalism. There are certainly elements of that in the heroic Henry V, but few of the kings actually come off as particularly noble. Most of them are rather ambitious and grasping. There's a lot of struggle back and forth to see, okay, who actually deserves the throne here? And who's going to get the crown? There's plenty of dark manipulation, such as with the very evil Richard III. And there are also kings who are just completely inept, like Henry VI. And there are times when Shakespeare asks the question, is it right to challenge and overthrow the king when he is abusing his position of power? Or is that inherently wrong? Does the crown come from God? There are moments in plays like Richard II, where Richard is clearly a terrible ruler and is abusing his position. And yet, when the crown is wrested from him, we ask the question, was that the right thing to do? And that question carries on throughout the entire career of Henry IV, even to Henry V, the great hero king. And Henry V, even 3 plays later, is praying in repentance and asking God not to hold the sins of wresting the crown away from Richard II against him in this moment. We also see the way that those destructive ambitions of these kings and these people striving for power causes real damage and pain to the country itself. In the Henry VI plays, particularly Henry VI Part 3, We see Henry stumbling from the battle while his wife continues the fight, and he sees what may be visions of fathers killing sons and sons killing fathers. The Wars of Roses as these devastating civil wars that pit family members against each other. And speaking of family, basically everybody struggling is related to everybody else. These are all uncles, cousins, nephews that were murdering for power. King John versus darling little Prince Arthur. And when they finally grasp the crown that they've been longing for so intently, it doesn't sit easy on the head. Henry V, who is receiving the crown legitimately from his father, wrestles with it as with an enemy. Richard III's manipulative charm that he uses to win everyone over to his side and then ultimately kill them seems to just melt away once the crown is finally on his head. None of his smooth talk and manipulation seem to work anymore. Henry VI almost seems to want to give away his crown at times, and never really attempts to rule at all. And as we read and watch these plays, we can't help but see our own political structure in them. World powers struggling against each other. It all feels all so familiar. And Shakespeare paints all these moral quandaries without really offering us a specific answer. We find ourselves in the same place we've always been. So here's a few key other things to pay attention to while you're looking at the history plays. First of all, plot. Shakespeare forces events of history, which he's read from history books, into a particular arc that fits his plot structure. That means at times he conflates characters together. That means at times he crunches time down. In fact, he's kind of notorious for making time move very oddly through these plays. At times in the plays, especially in the Henry VI plays, it will seem as though the characters have gone out for a walk and come home 15 years later. At the end of Henry VI Part 2, for example, Henry still seems like a very young man, but by the time we get into Henry VI Part 3, which apparently happens basically the same day, he's suddenly got a grown-up son. For the most part, you just have to shrug your shoulders and go with it. The two tetralogies are frequently called the Henriad. Unfortunately, there are multiple ways to use that term. You can talk about the first Henriad, but are we talking about the one that chronologically is later but was written earlier? Or vice versa? And sometimes people just say Henriad to describe all 8 plays. So, although it's a great term, it can be easily confusing. Shakespeare's earlier Henriad, that deals with the Wars of the Roses, is packed full of fascinating characters and exciting action. But it's really his second Henriad, his later Henriad, that truly shines. The one that deals with the arc of the rise of Henry V. Carrying the same characters over 4 plays truly allows for some fascinating developments. Margaret of Anjou in the Wars of Roses plays has a wild arc from the very first one to the last one. And in the Henry V plays, to watch Prince Hal develop over those plays and finally become the hero king Henry V is very satisfying. In the Henry V plays, when Henry V is a young man as Prince Hal, Shakespeare also develops a whole cast of side characters. The whole Eastcheap gang, with Falstaff and Bardolph and Pistol. Characters who started out as foils to develop Prince Hal, but ultimately became so lovable that Shakespeare even had to create a spin-off play about them. The Merry Wives of Windsor, which is not a history play at all. And that creates something that doesn't really show up in Shakespeare's other genres, which is sequels and characters that develop over multiple plays, making these some of Shakespeare's most enriched and enjoyable plays to read. Thanks for watching. You can click to subscribe or follow the link to my Patreon channel, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.